She was black, she was quiet, and she was ordered to leave her first-class seat. No reason, no explanation, just the sudden, cold hand of authority directing her to the back of the plane, as if she were never meant to be there at all. The crew didn't raise their voices. They didn't have to. Their clipped smiles and practiced tones did all the work, their eyes flicking over her skin like it confirmed something they'd already decided. Around her, no one intervened. Some watched. Most pretended not to. She gathered her things, rose with quiet dignity, and walked the aisle past the people who had just been offered champagne. Not one of them knew who she was. Not yet. But they would. This wasn't just another incident. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would tear through silence, strip away corporate masks, and leave a billion-dollar empire questioning who it had just tried to erase. If that first moment caught your attention, stay with it. Like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what you felt when you read that line. Your voice belongs in this conversation. Delaney Marsh didn't just arrive at gate C-19. She entered with the kind of presence that turned heads, though not for the reasons people would assume. She wasn't loud or flamboyant, nor did she wear the kind of fashion meant to draw stares. Her style was quiet confidence, a tailored burgundy trench coat cinched perfectly at the waist, charcoal slacks pressed to a knife's edge, a simple gold pendant resting above her collarbone. She walked the concourse like she'd walked 1,000 before it, not because she had something to prove, but because she didn't. In her hand, a compact black carry-on rolled noiselessly behind her, and in her wallet lay a first-class boarding pass paid for in full months ago. Delaney, 26, was used to moving through spaces where she was sometimes the only one who looked like her. She'd learned long ago how to carry herself, to be calm, articulate, respectful, even when the world around her wasn't. As she neared the gate, the boarding area was already in motion. Group 1 had been called, which included first-class passengers. She approached the line calmly, ticket ready, phone in hand, earbuds still in place but silent. The gate agent was a middle-aged woman with a tightly wound smile and a laminated badge that hung from a lanyard too stiff to turn naturally. She had greeted the older white couple ahead of Delaney with a warm grin and light banter, but that smile dimmed noticeably the moment Delaney stepped forward. It wasn't a scowl. It wasn't outright hostility. It was that subtle shift, the soft curl of suspicion under a professional tone. Delaney offered her ticket. The scanner chirped green. The woman held the pass longer than necessary, eyes scanning it, then scanning Delaney. "First class?" she asked, blinking twice. Delaney nodded once. "Yes, C2A." The gate agent checked the monitor again. The delay was slight, but it was long enough to make the man behind Delaney glance up from his phone. The agent eventually handed the ticket back, eyes not quite meeting hers. "You can proceed," she said tight-lipped. Delaney walked through the boarding tunnel with a flicker of unease. The carpeted floor muffled her steps as she approached the aircraft. At the threshold of the plane stood a statuesque flight attendant with cool blue eyes and a chiseled expression. Her blonde hair was tucked into a smooth bun, not a strand out of place. Her posture was rigid, her name badge reading Riddell. As Delaney crossed the doorway, the attendant's gaze swept her from coat collar to boots. The look wasn't overt, but it lingered just a moment too long. "Are you sure this is your section?" she asked, voice low but clipped. Delaney paused. "Yes," she said. "C2A. Let me see your boarding pass," the woman said, extending a manicured hand. Delaney complied, the air suddenly cooler than before. Riddell examined the pass, her lips pressing into a thin line. "There might be a misprint," she said. "Wait here, please." Delaney stepped aside, conscious of the growing line behind her. Passengers filed in quietly, their eyes flicking toward her, then back to their phones. A young man in business casual shifted impatiently, trying not to make it obvious he was listening. Riddell stepped away to consult a handheld device, lips moving in hushed conversation with another steward at the galley. When she returned, her tone was definitive. "Your seat has been reassigned. Please proceed to seat 22F. Delaney blinked. "I booked 2A. There's been a seating correction. Please head to the rear cabin now so we can complete boarding." "I confirmed my seat just this morning," Delaney said, voice calm but steady. "Ma'am," the attendant cut in louder now, "if you do not comply, we'll be forced to call a supervisor." The words weren't shouted, but they landed with weight. Eyes turned. A woman in a cream-colored blazer shifted in her seat to get a better look. Someone farther back whispered to their companion. Delaney felt the heat crawl up her neck. She had done nothing wrong, nothing out of place, and yet here she stood, on display, like a mistake that needed correcting. Saying anything else wouldn't help. Not now. Not here. She nodded once, slowly, and moved down the narrow aisle, her bag trailing behind her like an anchor. Row after row passed, polished shoes, tailored coats, drinks being offered on trays she would not see again. She arrived at row 22 and stowed her bag above before settling into the window seat. It was cramped. The seat cushion was warm from someone else's use. The window was scratched. A crying baby stirred 2 rows back. She sat silently, coat folded across her lap, staring straight ahead. A man in the aisle seat beside her cast a glance, then leaned slightly away, resting his elbow on the armrest with exaggerated caution. No welcome, no offer of help, no recognition that something had been taken from her. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. But a part of her, deep and quiet, folded in on itself. 20 minutes later, the plane began to taxi. The engines vibrated faintly beneath the floor. First class was out of view now, separated by a drawn curtain. She imagined the comfort there, the generous legroom, the wine, the silence, and then she let it go. She had been raised to rise above, to be dignified. But today, dignity had cost her a seat she had paid for. No apology was given. That silence was her only form of resistance now. Around her, passengers stirred into their routines. The man beside her put on headphones, not bothering to offer a greeting or even a glance. The flight attendants had already made a pass through first class by the time a single steward emerged into economy with a beverage cart, his movements brisk and indifferent. The man's name tag read M. Oakes. He paused at row 22, glanced at Delaney, then at the man next to her, and without a word, skipped their row entirely. Delaney watched him roll on, confusion flickering across her features, but she said nothing. Behind her, the woman in 23A called out for a ginger ale. Oakes returned moments later, cheerfully handing her the drink with a napkin folded crisply over the rim. The can of ginger ale was cold, condensation running down the side. Delaney watched it pass in front of her face, close enough to read the label, before it disappeared into the row behind her. 9. She closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her fingertips gently against her temple. It wasn't about the drink. It was never about the drink. It was about being seen, about being acknowledged. And somehow, seat 22F had become invisible. Time passed with a sluggish ache. The plane trembled slightly through light turbulence, and the fastened seatbelt sign blinked to life above them. A child a few rows forward whimpered, his mother whispering gentle reassurances as she handed him a toy. The overhead lights dimmed just enough to simulate comfort. Another attendant, this one younger and smiling with glossy lips, moved through the aisle distributing blankets. She made her way to row 21, paused briefly in 22, and leaned across Delaney without acknowledging her, handing a folded blanket to the man by the aisle. Then she moved on. Delaney's hands tightened slightly in her lap. Her coat was warm, but it wasn't about warmth. It was about what they were all willing to pretend wasn't happening. The second round of service brought a food tray, an odd mix of overcooked pasta, a pale roll, and a small fruit cup. The tray arrived with a clatter, dropped onto Delaney's tray table, without a word or glance. A single fork sat atop a crumpled napkin. No knife, no spoon, no apology. She stared at the meal, then unfolded her napkin and placed it neatly in her lap. She ate quietly, slowly, each bite taken with the kind of precision one uses in meetings and fundraisers. Each bite was a controlled response, a subtle declaration, "I am still here." The man beside her was served with ceremony, his meal presented upright and complete. He made no attempt to hide the contrast. Delaney did not ask for more utensils. She knew better. Requesting anything would be interpreted as difficult, a problem, and she had been trained her entire life not to be a problem. Halfway through the flight, she stood to stretch. As she moved toward the front of the cabin, she was stopped abruptly by a stern-faced steward near the curtain dividing economy and first class. Without explanation, he directed her toward the rear of the plane. "Use the lavatory in the back," he said, not bothering to lower his voice or make eye contact. The implication was clear. She had no business being near first class, not even for the restroom. Delaney nodded once and turned, walking the length of the aircraft again, past rows of quiet passengers, most of whom avoided looking at her. At the rear lavatory, she waited behind two others before finally entering the tiny, poorly lit space. Inside, she looked into the mirror. The woman staring back at her seemed unchanged. Her hair was still smooth, her collar still sharp, her lipstick unbroken. But in her eyes sat a deep and steady burn. A slow, contained heat she didn't dare let show on the surface. When she returned to her seat, a child was crying loudly 2 rows back. Delaney sat again, without a word. Her food tray had been cleared. Her water cup was gone. Only her crumpled napkin remained on the tray table, and someone had dropped a used plastic stirrer on top of it. She brushed it aside silently, folded her table back, and rested her hands once again in her lap. The crew had resumed their quiet patrol of the cabin. Their eyes passed over her without pausing. If she had disappeared entirely, she doubted anyone would notice. She began to feel the weight of it, not just the events of this flight, but the years that made up the background hum of moments just like it. Rooms where she was always second-guessed. Doors that opened slower for her. Conversations that paused when she entered. People who saw what they expected, not what was in front of them. On this plane, in this moment, every one of those years was condensed into a single grating truth. She was being tested again, and as always, she was expected to endure it silently. She shifted her weight, pulling her coat tighter across her lap. She stared out the window. There was no refuge in the sky. The flight continued. Around her, others settled in with pillows, some already dozing, others watching movies or scrolling through their phones. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She was still visible, but only just. The sound of footsteps brought her attention back to the aisle. One of the attendants was walking slowly, her eyes moving over the rows with casual attention. When she reached 22, her pace faltered. For a brief second, her eyes locked with Delaney's. The gentle ping of the seatbelt sign going off stirred movement around her. Passengers rose to stretch or line up for the rear lavatory. A flight attendant passed by, offering her nothing but a mechanical nod, not a single effort at eye contact or even recognition that she existed beyond the seat she occupied. Delaney pressed her palm lightly against her thigh, grounding herself with steady pressure. Her mind, trained by years of endurance in boardrooms and academic corridors where she was often the only one like her, tried to suppress the disappointment. But this wasn't just another quiet moment of erasure. This felt targeted, methodical, personal. A few rows up, she could hear murmurs. 2 flight attendants leaned in toward each other at the galley partition, their backs partially turned to the cabin. She didn't need to hear their words to read their posture. Shoulders tilted conspiratorially, heads dipped, soft laughter exchanged in controlled bursts. Occasionally, one would glance back toward the cabin, scanning the rows as if checking on a disruption they anticipated but hadn't yet occurred. Delaney noticed one of them eye her row for a beat too long before resuming conversation. It felt like being watched without being seen. When the beverage cart made its second round, it bypassed her row entirely once again. This time, the man beside her raised a brow and looked after the cart in confusion. Delaney said nothing. She stared ahead. She was not going to beg for water. Not after everything. A child's cry broke the relative hush of the cabin. The baby in 20B had woken up, red-faced and inconsolable, thrashing in his mother's arms. The mother, a woman no older than Delaney, was trying to comfort him, her face strained with exhaustion. Delaney's gaze softened just slightly. She reached into the side pocket of her carry-on beneath the seat and retrieved a folded cloth, a silken, embroidered square her mother had given her years ago, bearing the initials DM with a tiny stitched bird beneath them. She folded it into a small shape, reached forward, and caught the young mother's eye. Without a word, she offered the cloth. The woman blinked in surprise, hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet nod of gratitude. Within minutes, the baby calmed, distracted by the soft fabric, his tiny fingers exploring the delicate threads. The mother whispered thank you with her eyes. Delaney gave a faint nod and leaned back into her seat. The man beside her cleared his throat awkwardly, finally acknowledging her presence for the first time since boarding. He said nothing, but adjusted in his seat to make more room for her elbow on the shared armrest. It was minor, but it was something. A recognition, perhaps too late, that she had been ignored. The moment passed quickly, swallowed by the ambient noise of the plane and the low rumble of engines. Delaney closed her eyes, only briefly. She wasn't tired. She was heavy, worn. Worn not by the physical discomfort of economy, but by the weight of pretending not to notice the slow erosion of her dignity, minute by minute. She had made herself small all flight, still, composed. And now, even in this act of kindness toward a stranger, she remained invisible to the people who had taken her seat, her comfort, and her right to fairness. Another attendant appeared in the aisle, one she hadn't seen before. He was taller than the others, with dark hair slicked back neatly and a thin radio earpiece tucked discreetly behind one ear. His uniform was sharper, more tailored than the rest. He paused just past Delaney's row, touched the earpiece briefly, and leaned toward a fellow steward who stood by the galley. Delaney couldn't hear every word, but she caught fragments: unauthorized access, seating confusion, monitoring for escalation. Then, most chillingly, one of them looked toward her row and smirked. The taller man nodded subtly, gave a dry chuckle, and walked toward the front of the cabin. Delaney sat frozen, her thoughts racing. She wasn't just being overlooked. She was being managed, as if her very presence was a threat to be neutralized with professionalism wrapped in civility. It felt orchestrated, rehearsed. She had no proof, no hard evidence, but her instincts had never failed her. Somewhere near the cockpit, she imagined hushed voices discussing how best to contain a situation that had never existed. A young woman traveling alone, expecting the seat she paid for. Somehow, that was enough to warrant containment. Her existence in a space reserved for the privileged had disrupted an invisible order, and now the crew acted as if she might explode at any moment, despite the fact that she had done nothing but sit. Another hour passed. The cabin grew darker. A few passengers reclined fully, some wrapped in blankets, others sleeping with masks pulled low. Delaney remained upright, every muscle drawn. The silence wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. The attendants began collecting trash. The younger steward, the one who had ignored her during the drink service, finally paused at her row. He looked down at the tray table, saw nothing, and moved on. No eye contact, no greeting, as if she were simply not there. Delaney's fingers curled around the edge of her seat. The announcement came next, the captain's voice familiar and sterile as it filtered through the intercom, thanking passengers for flying and asking everyone to remain seated until the aircraft reached the gate. Then came the moment that sealed everything Delaney had felt but tried not to believe. A calm, polished voice crackled through the speaker once again, this time belonging to the lead flight attendant, who identified herself and proceeded to extend a warm, public thank you to their elite guests in first class for their loyalty and distinguished patronage. She listed seat numbers, named specific passengers, even called out the teenage girl in 2B who had boarded late and was offered champagne. But she did not mention Delaney, not by seat, not by name, not even in passing. Delaney sat in silence as a woman across the aisle from her mouthed the name of someone in first class and smiled to her seatmate in recognition. The applause that followed was scattered, brief, but unmistakably dismissive of anyone who didn't meet the standard they had so clearly laid out. It wasn't just an omission. It was a statement. Delaney had been erased so completely from the narrative of the flight that even her forced exile to economy was not acknowledged. She had been processed, displaced, and scrubbed from the experience like a smudge on a mirror, as if she had never existed in that seat to begin with. As the plane began its descent, the vibration of the engines changed pitch, growing louder and deeper as the aircraft adjusted its trajectory. The lights dimmed once more. Delaney braced herself with a hand on the armrest as the plane tilted forward. A steward walked past, collecting final trash. He took cups from the passengers on either side of her, but his eyes slid right over her tray table and her lap, moving on without pause. The plastic wrapper from her snack remained in place. The crumpled napkin with her initials still sat untouched. Her presence had not only been ignored but rejected, as if even the task of removing her waste was beneath consideration. Delaney turned her head to look out the window, though the only view was cloud cover and the fading glow of the setting sun. The light cast a faint reflection in the glass, enough for her to see her own face, tired and still composed, her jaw set, her eyes sharp but weary. She did not recognize the person in the reflection as someone defeated, but she saw clearly the weight she carried now, heavier than anything in her bag. As the wheels touched down and the brakes screamed briefly against the tarmac, she felt the slightest jolt in her stomach, not from a landing, but from the realization that her experience had been meticulously curated not to provoke her, but to silence her, to make her doubt her perception without giving her anything obvious enough to confront. A perfect model of institutionalized humiliation, delivered through smiles, policy, and plausible deniability. When the aircraft rolled toward the gate, the intercom came alive again, the voice once more cheerful as the attendant explained disembarking procedures. First class would exit first, followed by premium rows, and so on. Delaney's section would be among the last to leave. She remained seated, waiting, not rushing to gather her things. Her bag was already positioned beneath her seat. She knew she wouldn't need to fight for overhead space. She hadn't had any. She stared ahead as passengers filed past her. A few made eye contact, most did not. The same young woman with the baby from earlier paused briefly at her row, nodded once in gratitude, and moved on without a word. It was a quiet gesture, but one that clung to Delaney like a thread of dignity. She held it close, because it was the only human kindness she had been offered since boarding. As the cabin cleared, the crew began moving through the aisles with robotic efficiency, checking seatbacks and picking up the final bits of debris. One attendant reached her row and leaned in slightly as if to speak. Delaney prepared herself, expecting some closing remark or routine instruction. But the attendant looked past her, inspecting the empty seat beside her and the cushion. She picked up a stray receipt and nodded to herself before walking away, still not having acknowledged Delaney's presence. The final confirmation came when Delaney stepped off the plane. As she reached the top of the jet bridge, a small cluster of crew members stood in quiet conversation near the door. One of them, the lead steward from earlier, glanced toward her and whispered something to another. There was a smile. It was faint, quick, and gone in a blink. But Delaney saw it. She knew it for what it was. That look hadn't been a misunderstanding. It hadn't been exhaustion or miscommunication. It had been deliberate, coordinated, cruel. She walked to the baggage claim area, though she had no checked luggage. She needed time. She needed distance. She needed to gather the parts of herself that had been slowly chipped away for the last 3 hours. She took a seat near a wall of windows and stared out at the tarmac, watching as vehicles moved in patterns she couldn't hear, lights blinking in the distance, too far to touch. Inside the terminal, the lighting was bright, clinical, and unkind. Around her, travelers laughed, chatted, yawned, checked phones, called rides. Some moved with a carefree shuffle of vacationers. Others had the hurried pace of business travelers, suits loosened, ties pulled down. And no one saw her. Not really. Delaney sat still, her posture perfect, her coat folded neatly across her knees. To any observer, she would appear as a poised young professional simply pausing between destinations. But inside, she felt split. She had grown up knowing how to weather this kind of storm, being underestimated, looked past, spoken over. But today was different. Today had stripped something away that she wasn't sure how to name yet. The memory of the first-class passenger list announcement played again in her mind, each syllable like a thread pulling tight around her throat. Her name had not been forgotten. It had been removed, deleted, like she had never been there. She thought of the woman at the gate, the one who scanned her ticket and hesitated. She thought of the flight attendant who questioned her seat assignment with an expression barely masking disdain. She thought of the steward who had blocked her from using the first-class lavatory, eyes flat with institutional indifference. Every single interaction had been a brick, and together they built a wall around her, one she had been forced to sit behind while the rest of the world moved freely. Delaney's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She ignored it. There was nothing to say, no one she wanted to speak to. She needed to feel whole again before she spoke to anyone. She breathed slowly, deliberately, grounding herself in the sensation of her shoes against the tiled floor, the weight of her coat on her lap, the cool air against her face. But even in that stillness, the world wouldn't let her be invisible in peace. A cluster of teenagers sat 2 rows behind her, laughing too loud and speaking without care. At first, she didn't pay attention, but then a voice rose above the others, sharp and sarcastic. Someone made a comment about a woman being kicked out of first class on the flight from Chicago. Another voice added a mocking impression, raising his tone and slurring his words like someone pretending to be shocked or offended. The group burst into laughter. Delaney's heart stopped. She didn't turn around. She didn't move. She sat in that chair with her face carved from stone. The boys continued, one of them imitating the way she might have looked when escorted to the back of the plane. They had seen her. They had watched it happen, and now they found it funny. To them, it had been a moment of entertainment. To her, it had been a moment of erasure. Her throat tightened. She had no proof, no recording, no way to defend herself. Even if she did, what would she say? That she had been robbed of her dignity in the sky? That the people charged with her safety had instead dismantled her presence piece by piece, while strangers watched and laughed? It wasn't just the humiliation anymore. It was the normalization of it. The way her suffering had turned into a casual punchline in a public space, without consequence or awareness. Delaney stood slowly, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. She walked toward the restroom, not because she needed it, but because she needed space. She entered a stall and locked the door behind her. The silence wrapped around her like armor, thick and suffocating. She leaned against the door and closed her eyes. This wasn't the worst thing she had ever endured, but somehow it cut deeper than others. Maybe because it had happened in full view of so many. Maybe because it had been carried out by people in uniform, people who would be protected by policy and shielded by bureaucracy. Maybe because, for the first time in a long while, she had allowed herself to believe she might not have to brace for this anymore. She opened her eyes and stared at the metal door in front of her. She would not cry. Not here. Not where they might hear. Not where her pain might give them another reason to believe she was fragile. She inhaled deeply, held it, and exhaled with control. When she left the restroom, the teenagers were gone. The seats they occupied were now filled by a couple speaking quietly in another language. The moment had passed, but its echo stayed with her. She walked toward the terminal exit, every step a deliberate choice to move forward. The glass doors opened automatically, spilling her into the cold night air. The city lights shimmered in the distance. Her driver was waiting near the curb. He stepped forward when he saw her, taking her bag and opening the door with practiced efficiency. She nodded once in acknowledgement and climbed inside. The door closed behind her, sealing her in a quiet cocoon of leather seats and soft jazz humming from the speakers. She knew messages waited. Her assistant, perhaps a family member, and at least one friend who probably noticed her absence from the client reception she had originally intended to attend after the flight. But she couldn't face any of them yet, not until she had processed the weight of what had happened and found a way to lock it away where it couldn't be reached. Every breath she took felt heavier than it should have. Her chest didn't ache, but it carried something that couldn't be dislodged. The memory of those boys laughing, mimicking her with exaggerated tones, still rang in her ears. That sound had somehow echoed louder than the quiet cruelty of the flight crew or the sterile indifference of the gate agent. Those boys had not known her, yet they'd laughed without mercy. That laughter had punctured the last layer of armor she had left, because it confirmed that what she had experienced had not been invisible. It had been a performance for others, a display. Her humiliation had been consumed for sport. The car pulled to a stop outside her hotel, a luxury tower wrapped in silver glass and manicured hedges, and the driver stepped out without a word to open her door. She stepped onto the curb and nodded once in thanks before walking briskly into the lobby. The doorman greeted her by name, offering a warm smile and a casual compliment, but she gave only a brief, polite nod in return. He didn't know. No one did. The lobby was quiet, bathed in soft gold light that gleamed off the marble floors and glass-paneled walls. Delaney moved across it with her usual grace, her heels tapping softly as she reached the elevator and pressed the button. Inside the elevator, the silence wrapped around her again, this time thicker, heavier. Her reflection in the mirrored walls showed no sign of what she felt, just a woman in perfect control of her posture, her appearance, her presence. But inside, something had begun to splinter. When the doors opened on her floor, she stepped into the corridor, walked to her suite, and entered without haste. The lock clicked behind her, and she was alone. The lights warmed the space around her, the suite exactly as she'd left it, pristine, elegant, and sterile. The scent of fresh linen and soft lavender drifted from the air vents. She set her bag on the bench at the foot of the bed and removed her coat slowly, folding it with care before draping it over the back of a chair. She stood there for a long moment, not moving, simply breathing. Then, almost without thinking, she crossed the room to her laptop and opened it. The screen lit her face as she logged in, navigating through files and folders until she reached the itinerary for the next day's meetings. Names and agendas scrolled past her eyes, but she didn't focus on them. Her gaze drifted to the name at the top of the executive partner list. It was the airline's CEO. She stared at the name, letting her finger hover above the trackpad without clicking. She wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. She shut the laptop and stepped back. She went to the bathroom, washed her hands slowly, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was the same. Her eyes were sharper, her jawline more defined, but she didn't feel like the woman she had been that morning. She felt stretched, reshaped by invisible hands. She walked back into the bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed, not knowing how long she stayed there. At some point, hours passed. Night had fully settled outside, and the lights of the city flickered like distant signals she couldn't decipher. Her body was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. She changed into soft clothes and sat again by the window, watching traffic move below. She wasn't thinking of revenge. She wasn't thinking of lawsuits or headlines. What filled her now wasn't rage. It was the cold, final understanding that this was never about a seat. It had never been about an error or policy or logistics. It had been about denial of access, about control, about who gets to exist in what space without justification. Her phone buzzed again. She ignored it. Then came the knock. A single, sharp rap on the suite's door. She froze, her muscles tensing. She wasn't expecting anyone. She rose slowly, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. A hotel staff member stood there with a sealed envelope. She opened the door without a word, accepted the envelope, and closed the door again. Inside was a short printed note on hotel stationery, informing her that a representative from the airline had stopped by earlier that evening to deliver a gift basket to apologize for an unspecified inconvenience during her flight. The basket had been left at the front desk. Delaney stared at the paper, then folded it once, twice, and dropped it in the trash. She didn't go down to retrieve the basket. She didn't want their apology. Her body had gone through the motions of rest, lying still, breathing deeply, but her mind had remained fully awake, reconstructing every detail of the flight, the dismissal, the mockery, the forced silence, and the note delivered with cowardice. She hadn't retrieved the gift basket. She wouldn't. She no longer wanted correction or compensation. What she wanted now was for the truth to stand where it could not be ignored. The morning meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the Crescent Tower, a glass and steel structure on the edge of downtown that served as the global headquarters of the international airline that had mistreated her. It was a building she had visited twice before, though never under these circumstances. On the previous visits, she had entered as a silent partner, a strategic mind brought in to advise and review, not to draw attention or control the room, but to shape the outcome with intellect and quiet influence. But this time, she would not be a name buried in fine print or a face quietly seated beside louder voices. This time, she would step into the room for what was hers. The car ride to the Crescent Tower was short and silent, and the moment she arrived, the lobby's security staff recognized her without hesitation. She offered no greeting, just a brief nod as she was ushered past the check-in station and into a private elevator that required no keycard swipe. The elevator doors closed behind her, and her reflection appeared in the mirrored walls again. Unlike the night before, she did not feel hollow. She felt measured, ready. The elevator opened into the executive suite on the 39th floor, where a meeting room encased in glass offered a panoramic view of the city. A long mahogany table sat in the center, surrounded by 10 leather chairs. On the far wall, a digital screen displayed the logo of the airline and a title that read Strategic Equity Summit Phase 2. She stepped inside the room and was greeted by a junior associate who began speaking immediately, apologizing for the absence of several board members who were running late, offering water, listing the schedule. Delaney listened, nodded once, and took her seat at the head of the table. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. She placed her tablet in front of her, angled slightly, and opened the documents she had reviewed throughout the night. The associate faltered briefly, unsure whether to continue the prepared script, and Delaney offered a single raised brow that halted the chatter completely. One by one, members of the executive board entered the room, white men in tailored suits, polished shoes, and practiced smiles. Some offered greetings, others nods. A few hesitated when they saw who had taken the head of the table, but none challenged it. They had all read the memo. They knew who she was. What they did not know, or perhaps had forgotten, was the magnitude of her influence. Delaney had no title on the building's directory, but she controlled the funds that made the recent fleet expansion possible. She had signed off on the final tranche of capital used to upgrade the airline's European terminals. She was the key liaison for a multinational investment group that held a decisive 24% stake in the company. She wasn't an outsider. She was the quiet force that had helped build their future. And yesterday, their staff had decided she didn't belong in first class. The CEO entered last, a tall man with graying temples and an expression crafted for camera lenses and press releases. He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes and extended a hand. Delaney stood, met his handshake with a grip that was firm but without warmth, and resumed her seat before he could settle into his. The room shifted slightly, the center of gravity now clearly defined. Delaney waited as the assistant began the presentation, outlining strategic metrics, forecasts, and investment returns. She allowed the charade to continue for 10 minutes, listening as they reviewed talking points and slid through charts and numbers she had already memorized. Then, without raising her voice, she tapped the screen of her tablet. The assistant paused. Delaney's voice filled the room, calm, exact, and unshaken. She asked a single question about an operational ethics clause included in the investment agreement, one tied to conduct, public behavior, and systemic accountability. The question was not accusatory, not yet, but it was precise, anchored in language none of them could refute. The CEO responded with a carefully worded answer about protocols, then shifted the conversation to financials, hoping to steer away from discomfort. Delaney allowed him the detour for less than 60 seconds. Then she interrupted, not loudly, not rudely, but with a clarity that closed all exits. She recounted her experience on the flight. Not with emotion, not with dramatics, but with the cold, undeniable accuracy of someone who understood contracts, policies, and reputational risk. She laid out the facts: the seating change, the absence of explanation, the refusal of service, the public omission, the mocking passengers who had clearly seen something orchestrated by the crew. She noted the apology delivered through a hotel note, unaccompanied by action. The room shifted again. Someone cleared their throat. Another tapped a pen quietly against his notepad. The assistant's fingers hovered uselessly above the keyboard. The CEO began to speak, something about investigating the incident, but Delaney held up a hand, and the room fell silent. She reached into her bag and withdrew a folded letter, a signed agreement prepared by her legal team and already notarized. It detailed the withdrawal of the strategic investment contingent on violations of the operational ethics clause. The clause had been activated. Her group would pull funding. It was the physical embodiment of consequence, the translation of every humiliating moment she had endured into measurable action. No one reached for the letter. No one spoke. The CEO, still seated 3 chairs down from her, held his breath in a way that betrayed his understanding. He knew the weight of what she had just done. A 24% withdrawal wasn't merely a loss of capital. It was a signal to every investor still watching. It was a stain on quarterly projections, a direct impact on public valuation, and a warning to board members who measured leadership by control, not integrity. He had misread her. He had assumed she was simply another business liaison, one who could be reassured with apologies and vague promises of internal reviews. But what sat before him now was not just a partner. It was a reckoning. Delaney didn't sit back down. She didn't retreat. Instead, she walked slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the boardroom's eastern wall and stood there, her back to them, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. Behind her, one of the younger executives shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him, and whispered something to the man beside him. Delaney heard it. She heard all of it. The words weren't loud, but they were enough. Questions about whether this was really happening, speculation about how long she had been planning it, disbelief that someone like her had the authority to carry it through. That final phrase echoed louder than the rest. Someone like her. She turned slowly, her heels silent on the polished floor, and fixed her gaze on the man who had spoken. He flinched, not in fear, but in realization. Delaney didn't address him. She didn't need to. Her expression was sufficient. She walked back to the head of the table and placed both hands flat against the wood. Then she spoke again, her voice smooth and low, each syllable intentional. She recited facts, details of their diversity pledges, the exact language used in their last 3 annual reports to promote inclusivity, the exact wording of their in-flight conduct guidelines, which prohibited discrimination in any form. She asked them, rhetorically, what those words meant if not enforced. She referenced previous incidents, buried in press silence, where passengers had reported similar experiences but lacked the leverage to force change. She reminded them that silence had once been their protection. It no longer would be. Across the table, faces changed. The CEO's jaw flexed. The senior compliance officer opened his mouth but found no sentence worth uttering. The younger executive who had whispered lowered his eyes to his lap. The room, built to house power, now bore witness to its misapplication. Delaney gathered her things. She placed her tablet back into her bag, adjusted the strap over her shoulder, and offered a final statement, one that neither threatened nor warned, but promised. A promise that they would remember this day not because of the financial blow, but because of what it marked, the moment their unchecked culture was seen, named, and answered. She turned and walked toward the door. The junior assistant rushed to open it, fumbling slightly as it swung inward. Delaney stepped into the hallway and left the room behind her, the sound of her departure louder than any voice had been inside. The corridor outside was empty, its glass walls reflecting her image in fractured segments. Each reflection caught a different angle of her, shoulders squared, jaw firm, eyes unwavering. She didn't slow her pace. Her driver was waiting at the ground floor, engine running, door already open. She stepped into the back seat, and as the vehicle pulled away, she allowed herself one long exhale. The phone in her bag buzzed. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. She retrieved it. Messages were coming in. Her legal team confirming receipt of the withdrawal letters filing. Her senior analyst noting a shift in stock discussion boards. A private message from an industry partner who had been watching the morning meeting through discreet channels. The ripple had begun. But there was one message that caught her attention. A number she recognized, belonging to a senior airline executive who had not been in the meeting. The message was brief. It requested a private conversation, said they were unaware of the situation, and expressed concern over how it had been handled. Delaney didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, she opened her calendar app and reviewed her schedule. The week was full. A charity gala, a quarterly board session, a private summit with potential investors from East Asia. But she would make time, not to answer to them, to prepare what would come next. Her influence had always been quiet, a force behind closed doors, shaping outcomes without recognition. That era had ended. The company's reputation would suffer, not from scandal, but from exposure. They had built a brand on curated images and hollow pledges. Now, those same tools would amplify their failure. She would not need to raise her voice. Others would do that for her. Word had already reached 3 major stakeholders. 2 of them had sent messages within minutes of each other, requesting clarification. The silence from the 3rd was telling. They were calculating, weighing costs, preparing contingencies. The legal department had already flagged the ethics clause breach and initiated a document review. Investors who had never missed a quarterly call were now scheduling unscheduled audits. The company's senior compliance officer was summoned to the internal review committee and made to answer pointed questions about conduct oversight, systemic accountability, and the plausibility of coincidence in the passenger seating incident. He offered answers, but his voice lacked conviction, and his explanations rested too heavily on technicalities. The board members were not reassured. That same morning, the CEO issued a directive to the communications department to draft a statement addressing the situation, but not in full, not by name, and certainly not acknowledging Delaney Marsh. He wanted language that appeared transparent without actually confessing fault, phrasing that sounded concerned but revealed nothing, a tone that deflected rather than accepted. The draft was rejected 3 times before it was deemed sufficiently vague. It was then circulated to media partners with no distribution timeline, meant as a safeguard, not a statement. But events moved faster than they expected. The first public tremor appeared on a business blog specializing in venture capital behavior. The article detailed the withdrawal of a major investor from the airline's capital partnership, citing ethics clause violations and failure to meet stated diversity standards. The author didn't name Delaney, but noted the move came just days after a widely reported incident involving a passenger's unexplained removal from a first-class seat. Within hours, industry analysts began to speculate. Market watchers pointed out the timing, the investment firm's reputation, and the airline's noticeable silence. The stock dropped slightly, then rebounded, then dropped again, this time harder, as 2 more firms filed inquiries requesting further disclosure on the incident. Meanwhile, internally, the airline's HR division launched a formal review of the flight crew in question. Statements were collected. Interviews were scheduled. And yet, none of the staff involved, neither the lead steward, the gate agent, nor the flight attendants, could produce a consistent explanation for why Delaney Marsh had been moved. Notes were missing. Seat logs had discrepancies. Verbal orders were cited, but no one could recall who gave them. The crew attempted to fall back on protocol, but the gaps in their recollection became liabilities, and what had been arrogance just days earlier turned into evasion. The CEO, now feeling pressure from the board and external stakeholders, authorized administrative leave for the staff involved and issued private apologies to 2 of the major investors who had raised concerns. But it was too late to contain the narrative. A journalist with deep industry contacts published an exposé revealing the details of the passengers' treatment on Flight 394, citing anonymous sources close to the company and quoting language from the internal investigation. The story reached top business outlets by evening. Although Delaney's name was never mentioned, the descriptions were unmistakable: a high-level investor, female, African American, relocated from first class without explanation, denied basic amenities, subjected to public omission, and dismissed by the crew. Public sentiment turned quickly. Advocacy groups called for transparency. Social media threads trended with hashtags demanding accountability. Even politicians weighed in, some subtly and others more pointedly, criticizing corporate hypocrisy in diversity pledges. The airline issued a statement 2 days later, carefully worded and legally reviewed. It promised to re-evaluate staff training programs, conduct a full review of in-flight conduct policies, and commit to ongoing dialogue with affected communities. But no direct admission was given, and no names were offered. In response, the withdrawal of the 24% stake gained further momentum. The investment firm behind Delaney's position, now backed by additional silent partners, announced plans to redirect those funds into companies with verified diversity metrics and accountability infrastructure. The move was strategic and symbolic, designed to highlight not just consequence, but contrast. Meanwhile, inside the company, chaos rippled through management tiers. Department heads questioned whether leadership had withheld details. Mid-level managers scrambled to review customer service policies. Flight crew unions demanded clarity on disciplinary procedures. Morale dipped, not out of sympathy for Delaney, but from the realization that the hierarchy protecting them was cracking. Delaney, for her part, remained silent. She did not speak to the media. She did not release a statement. She did not leak internal documents or call for firings. Her silence was not passive. It was deliberate. She let the structure speak for itself, let their own contradictions surface in their words and in actions. At a private meeting with her legal and strategy teams, she was briefed on the full extent of a reaction. One analyst noted that internal shareholder meetings had become tense. Another reported a drop in applicant interest from key universities. A third quietly mentioned that other companies had reached out, requesting her input on establishing real conduct clauses in their equity contracts. Delaney absorbed it all, her expression unchanged. The damage was not finished, but it had begun. At the end of the week, the airline's board called an emergency session, this time without the CEO present. It was brief and decisive. By the time a full month had passed since the incident aboard Flight 394, the airline's image had transformed from a symbol of streamlined luxury and global efficiency to a cautionary tale whispered in executive lounges and boardrooms across the country. The story had never become a viral social media storm, never escalated into hashtags splashed across every screen, but that absence of spectacle only deepened its impact. The silence surrounding it had proven louder, more haunting. What echoed through the corridors of power was not outrage but reckoning. Investors no longer asked how the situation would be spun. They asked why no one saw it coming. Leadership teams across industries held emergency retreats on equity compliance, unconscious bias, and contract enforcement. But it was inside the walls of the airline's new leadership division, now under interim guidance, where the most meaningful changes began to take root. Gone were the vague statements and cautious apologies. In their place came structured action. The new leadership team initiated an unprecedented policy audit led by an independent advisory board. They didn't just comb through manuals. They examined culture. They evaluated every layer of interaction from check-in counters to cabin service and crew command structures. They reviewed employee demographics, performance evaluations, and complaint handling procedures. They uncovered patterns long ignored or dismissed, that mirrored Delaney's experience, and each revelation deepened the board's awareness of the rot that had been growing beneath the surface of their operations. One by one, layers of willful ignorance were peeled back. Quiet settlements made in the past were re-examined. Customer complaints dismissed as misunderstanding were reopened. Training programs once celebrated for their branding were revealed to be hollow in practice, with no follow-through, no accountability, and no cultural awareness. In the center of this transformation was a question the company could no longer avoid. Who had they really been serving, and at what cost? That question led them back to Delaney, not as a scapegoat, not as a PR solution, but as a mirror. Her silence, her unwavering refusal to engage in theatrics, forced them to reckon with something far deeper than image. She had shown them what it looked like when dignity became the most unshakable form of power. And eventually, the call came. Not from an assistant, not from a PR firm. It came directly from the board's new acting chair, a woman named Judith Rayner, who had once shared a table with Delaney on a different board in a different city years ago, when Delaney's influence was still quiet, still being written. Judith didn't ask for a meeting. She asked for guidance, not as a favor, not as leverage, but as someone ready to change. Delaney agreed to meet, not in a private office, not in a boardroom, but in a public civic center on the edge of the city, a place where policy met people, where the clean air of accountability replaced the sterile filters of corporate strategy rooms. The two women sat across from each other, with no cameras, no audience, only truth between them. Judith spoke first, her voice steady but humble. She did not attempt to defend the past. She did not explain away the mistakes. She named them. She accepted them. She acknowledged what had happened to Delaney, not as a single instance, but as a reflection of a system built to benefit a select few while surviving off the exclusion of others. Delaney listened, not coldly, not unforgivingly, but with the weight of someone who had carried the truth long before anyone else dared name it. Then she spoke, not to punish, but to define what the future would demand. She outlined a series of conditions not tied to money, not tethered to appearances, but to measurable transformation. New recruitment standards that prioritized not just representation, but lived experience. Anonymous employee feedback protocols that funneled data directly to oversight committees. Monthly audits by external watchdogs unaffiliated with the company. A full scholarship initiative to train and elevate underrepresented professionals into aviation leadership roles. And most importantly, a cultural contract, not for press, not for branding, but for real, sustained internal reform. Judith agreed to all of it, not as a concession, but as necessity. Over the following months, change began, not loud, not flashy, but real. Crew members reported noticing the shift in tone during training. Supervisors no longer led with policy. They led with presence. Gate agents learned names, not just barcodes. First-class lounges carried books authored by those whose voices had once been left out of luxury spaces. In time, the airline launched a new initiative, one that did not bear Delaney's name, but bore her imprint in every clause, every policy, every training module. She remained distant from public involvement. That was never the goal. Her face never appeared in campaigns. She gave no interviews. Her work continued where it always had, in rooms that mattered, behind doors where change is designed before it's performed. But those who paid attention knew. They knew who had been responsible for the shift. And they began to ask deeper questions in their own companies, in their own systems. What invisible harm have we normalized? What power have we dismissed because we never bothered to see it? What future are we failing to build because we fear the discomfort of change? The crew who had orchestrated her humiliation, those who had smirked, whispered, ignored, and undermined, faced their own reckonings. Some were quietly dismissed. Others went through restorative accountability processes guided by cultural reform advisors. A few, surprisingly, chose to stay, to learn, to change. One of them, the lead steward from that day, requested a one-on-one session with a company counselor. He asked to understand what he had done wrong beyond protocol, beyond policy, beyond training. He admitted to assumptions, to pride, to the false belief that hierarchy gave him the right to enforce presence. He didn't excuse his behavior. He sought to undo it. That moment mattered, not because it was performative, but because it was sincere. Delaney never saw him again. She never needed to. Her role was never vengeance. It was truth. And truth, once made visible, does not ask for applause. It changes the soil so nothing harmful can grow unnoticed again. Her story didn't end in headlines or courtrooms. It ended in shifts, the kind that happen inside systems, inside people. She had arrived on Flight 394 as a target of arrogance. She left it as an architect of consequence. And those who once saw her as a silent body in a misplaced seat now understood that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it enters quietly, sits in the seat it paid for, and waits until it owns the plane. The end. If you followed Delaney's journey this far, thank you. If you found the story compelling, thought-provoking, or powerful, consider giving it a like and subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. Every bit of support helps these stories reach more people who care about justice, power, and transformation. I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of the plot? Did the twists land the way you expected? Or did something catch you off guard? Which stage hit you the hardest? Let's talk about it. Also, where in the world are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment and let me know. It's always incredible to see how stories connect us across cities, countries, and continents. Your voice matters here.